started. And today's call will feature WELC board member and professor of philosophy and environmental studies, Dr. Brian G. Henning. This was on the invite, but a bit of background here. At WELC, we've outlined a bold vision for what we call an ecology of kinship, a way of seeing that honors the deep interconnection of people, land, water, and wildlife. In reaction to this vision, some might smile politely and say that it's a nice idea, but that is too idealistic, insisting we must be realistic instead. And so Brian will argue that the dilemma between idealism and realism is a false dichotomy that primarily benefits the status quo. And he'll be discussing how embracing an ecology of kinship can inspire practical action and lasting change for the West that we all love. So again, thank you for joining us today, and I will hand this over to Brian. So Brian, whenever you're ready, go for it.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. It's great to be with you again today. If you weren't previously on a call, there's another webinar that I gave that Michelle may be able to make available to you as well. This is in some ways a follow-up on that presentation. As Michelle mentioned, I'm a professor of philosophy. I teach environmental ethics at Gonzaga University, which is in Eastern Washington State. And I've been a proud board member of WELC's for about 4 years. And at our last all staff retreat, we discussed this topic a little bit. And so we thought maybe we would share it with some of our broader community of support. So I'm going to just jump right into it. If you were on my last talk, these first few slides will be a little bit repetitive, but they are kind of part of a similar conversation in my mind. So part of the way I think about this is to say we've got a really serious problem. And if we were to boil it down, it would be something very concisely stated as it's warming, it's us, experts agree, it's bad and we can fix it. What I'd like to focus on with you is not only whether it's happening and it is bad and experts do agree, but really if we were to try to fix it, what would that look like, and what is WELC's role in trying to fix it? And we frequently, I think maybe too frequently, jump from that statement to kind of imagining we know what we're talking about. We know what a fix needs to look like. And some of them we do. We need to decarbonize our energy and transportation, for example, in order to reduce emissions. That's really clear, but is that it? Is it really the case that the problem is just emissions, or is the problem deeper than that? And as an environmental philosopher, I do think that the problem is a little bit deeper. Oh, and just as I get into this, again, to mention, as Michelle did, that if you have questions and comments, please do feel free to go to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Just open that up and feel free to pop in questions or comments as I go, and we can start there when we get to the Q&A at the end. To set up our context on this, I'd like to show, as I did last time, the first few minutes of a video, if the technology cooperates, from Naomi Klein. She wrote this book called This Changes Everything, and then did a documentary version with her partner, Avi Lewis. And I'd like to see if I can show that and then come back and use that as a setup for our narrative conversation here today. So fingers crossed, technology cooperates. Michelle, is this coming through?
I'm seeing it. Yep. Yep. You're good on volume. I can hear it.
All right. Wonderful. Thanks. We'll be back in just a minute.
Can I be honest with you? I've always kind of hated films about climate change. What is it about those vanishing glaciers and desperate polar bears that makes me want to click away? Is it really possible to be bored by the end of the world? It's not that I don't care what happens to polar bears. It's just that we're told that the cause isn't out there, it's in us. It's human nature. We're innately greedy and short-sighted. And if that's true, there is no hope. But when I finally stopped looking away, traveled into the heart of the crisis, met people on the front lines, I discovered so much of what I thought I knew was wrong. And I began to wonder, what if human nature isn't the problem? What if even greenhouse gases aren't the problem? What if the real problem is a story, one we've been telling ourselves for 400 years? This first struck me in the craziest place. I was in a stately home in the English countryside that looked an awful lot like Downton Abbey. It was an invitation-only meeting hosted by the world's oldest scientific organization, the Royal Society. Instead of ordering around the servants, the people here were trying to order around the sun. I mean the sun, in the sky. They were discussing a plan to spray chemicals into the stratosphere to turn down the temperature for planet Earth.
What you need to do is put a small number of particles up in the upper part of the atmosphere. And those particles will deflect just a tiny bit of light. One garden hose to the sky could eliminate global warming for the entire northern hemisphere.
In other words, let's solve the problem of pollution with more pollution.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid.
It is.
You're bearing the lead. Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the ass? Blanketing the earth in sulfuric acid, because I'm all for it. This is all.
Here's the thing. This idea may be crazy, but it's also totally logical within the story that the Royal Society pioneered in the 17th century. Here's how it goes. The Earth is not, as most people thought back then, a mother to be feared and revered. No. Science had granted men godlike powers. The Earth is a machine, and we are its engineers, its masters. We can sculpt it like a country garden. We can extract from it whatever we want. These scientists help turn the mother into the motherlode. This story is where the long road to global warming began. When I realized that, I stopped tuning out those sad polar bears, because unlike human nature, stories are something we can change.
So as Naomi Klein mentions at the end of the video, some people think that the climate crisis is caused by human nature, that we're inherently greedy and self-destructive, and that's what's causing the climate crisis. And as she notes in the video, if that's the case... So sorry, everybody. I touched my hot corner and my computer went to sleep and I could not stop the video. That's my workaround to be able to share a video that I own to stream so that Zoom doesn't stop me from doing that. Okay, apologies. Hopefully you can hear me again. So this is what I'd like to suggest is that Naomi Klein is helping us to try and imagine what exactly is the problem. Some people would suggest that the problem is us, that we're inherently destructive and greedy. And if that's the problem, as she puts it, then we're in trouble, because if it's human nature, presumably that's not something that we can change. And so then we're doomed. But as she notes at the end of the video there, she thinks that the problem isn't human nature, but that it's rather, she puts it, a story. The ultimate problem that we're trying to solve is a story that we've been telling to ourselves about what we are and how we're related to our world. And as she notes that unlike human nature, stories are something we could choose to change. And I like this framing because if the problem that we're trying to solve is not just emissions, or human nature, but rather a narrative that we've been telling ourselves that we're lords and masters of nature, and we can do with the earth as we please. If that's the problem, then the fix is going to be quite a bit larger than just simply putting up solar panels and calling it a day. And this is the view of a favorite, his cultural historian is a favorite of mine, Thomas Berry, who makes a similar point in a similar way, that the old story that we've been telling about ourselves is broken down, but that we don't really have a good alternative story yet. If we're not lords and masters of nature, exactly what are we? And this becomes part of our work, I think, if we want to take it up. Similarly, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a wonderful indigenous scientist, makes a similar point in braiding sweetgrass as well. And so this idea of story or narrative, this meaning making that we have, becomes part of the challenge of solving the genuine underlying problems that we have in front of ourselves. That part of our task is to imagine how we can become mutually beneficial to the rest of life on the planet, that we would have equitable, thriving human civilizations on a verdant planet. That's a genuine fix, in my judgment, that goes beyond just the technical aspects that we need. And that then our task is not just to manage pollution or to make consumption sustainable, but to, in some ways, try to become meaningful members of the wider community of life. Okay, so that's the basic idea. The fair question that you might respond with, and again, do feel free to go to the Q&A and start asking questions if you have any, is exactly how would we achieve that? This is all really nice. How would we achieve that? And as Michelle mentioned, WELC is starting to step forward to try and provide an answer to these questions. And in some of its recent documents, WELC leadership have been outlining what they're calling an ecology of kinship, that to achieve this vision of transforming a transformative change, it's imperative to empower the emergence of new social, political, and economic systems. And that to do that, we need to bring about more change than just the merely technical. We need to develop systems that can operate within our social and ecological boundaries. We need to liberate ourselves from the delusional notion that human technology and innovation can transcend the Earth's capacity or serve as a substitute for a value-based ecology of kinship. We need to place people and communities at the heart of decision-making and recognize that people are entitled to participate in the development of rules and plans and project-level decisions that affect them. That's central to environmental justice, is meaningful involvement of communities. The public participation fosters the trust, belonging, and dignity essential to a healthy, high-functioning government that serves the public interest and provides opportunity to resolve or at least mitigate disputes. That we respect the right of ecological systems to thrive independent of human use and valuation, that we recognize that those systems themselves have intrinsic value, something that as an environmental philosopher, we talk quite a bit about. The world around us is more than human. It's resplendent with a rich array of biodiversity that has evolved for millennia in the context of specific geological landscapes on Earth's climate. Independent of humans' use and valuation, this world is deserving of respect and protection. We should weave together the natural and built infrastructure to further this ecology of kinship, that recognize that ecological systems provide a host of goods and services that can complement a human infrastructure. This includes goods such as food, of course, and fresh water, and energy resources, as well as services such as sequestration of carbon, flood control, natural filtration, and pollination. The health of these systems thus serves as a precondition of well-rounded human abundance, just as much as material infrastructure. Avoiding and minimizing the harm caused by the built infrastructure is therefore essential, even as we must recognize that the repair, replacement, and evolution of built infrastructure from housing to energy is also essential to address the climate crisis and provide for people and communities. And then finally, we would advocate it as a part of an ecology of kinship, transformative change that will be a multi-generational endeavor. What WELC is calling its Emergent Horizons campaign will prove to be a highly contested effort, given the transgressive efforts of the existing social, political, and economic order to hold on to power. We'll talk more about that today together. So we need to prepare for a multi-front, generational-long effort. This is an amazingly, breathtakingly robust vision that WELC is laying out. Its answer to what the genuine problem is and what a genuine fix is. This is a robust, full-bodied account of what a genuine fix to our genuine problems might be. And I'm really inspired by it. Someone listening to this, maybe not a WELC supporter, but someone, well, maybe some of you, might say to yourself, this all sounds really good, but it's just too idealistic, that we have really real problems with really real timeframes, and that noble rhetoric is just, you know, fine, but too idealist. Shouldn't we instead be realistic? And so sometimes this argument sounds like this. Maybe you've said this argument or heard it before. Ideals are nice. In fact, maybe this particular ideal could even be right. Doesn't really matter, though, because it's too idealistic. We need to be realistic. It's a common response, I think, when confronted with something as ambitious as what WELC is depicting in others. If we were to spend a second to reconstruct this argument in a little bit more formal sense, it might look something like this. A position is either realistic or it's idealistic, but not both. A position is realistic if its ends are achievable. And a position is unrealistic or idealistic, I should say, if its ends cannot be fully achieved. And that we should really only pursue positions that are achievable. And so therefore, we should not pursue positions that are idealistic. There are a couple ways of responding to this argument. One way would be to dispute that our position is idealistic, that to try and say its ends are fully achievable, to say that ideals are achievable. I actually don't go that direction myself. I don't think the problem is with premise number 3. I would grant, in fact, that ideals, by definition, are not fully achievable. I don't think that that's their problem. I think actually the problem with this argument is premise 4, that we should really only pursue ends that are fully achievable. And let me see if I can explain why. To me, we misunderstand often the function of ideals. Ideals are actually the indispensable measuring sticks relative to which progress is measured. They allow us to determine what's good, what's bad, what counts as success, what counts as failure. They are by definition not fully achievable, but that's not a criticism of them. Their value is in giving us our goals, our orientation. And in this way, if we define ideals in this way, potentially, actually, we can see that idealism and realism are not opposed, but they're actually mutually implicative, that they require each other. And that's what I'd like to suggest in the next few slides here. That actually, I think frequently people who respond with, that's nice, but it's too idealistic, we need to be realistic, are actually just defending the status quo's ideals, whether they know it or not. And let's be clear, the status quo does have ideals. Its ideals are things like we can achieve happiness through consumption, that the economy can grow forever. We can forever produce more goods next quarter than the one before, that we can have security through the threat and use of violence. Each of these are ideals. The idea of happiness through consumption, infinite economic growth, security through violence are ideals. They can't be fully achieved. But that's not a criticism of them. The point is that they're the status quo's ideals. But because they're the status quo ideals, they get to be considered realistic by default because they are the status quo's ideals. They're realistic by default. So whether people know it or not, frequently when they're saying that sounds nice, but it's too idealistic, they're really just simply knowingly or not defending the ideals of the status quo. I would suggest instead, along with several other figures whom I admire, that ideals are actually indispensable, as I suggested earlier, that they're the engines of progress, as the Dalai Lama puts it, that they pull us and move us forward. Or to quote another Buddhist, Thich Nhat Hanh, I really like this quote when he suggests that if we're lost and we don't know which way to go, it's really useful to find the North Star, not because we expect to get there. We don't expect to arrive at Polaris, right? I'm not sure that would be particularly useful. The value of the North Star is giving us our orientation, our direction, and that's about as useful and practical as it gets. And this is, I think, how ideals are. They are our North Stars. They give us our orientation, our direction. They say, oh, if that's the North Star, then I should be headed in this direction. And that's particularly realistic and particularly useful. Or to quote one of my favorite philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead, he argues that ideals are at once gadflies irritating us and beacons luring us. And I like this dual presentation of ideals, that they irritate us in the sense that they prick us and say, we're falling short, you're falling short, you're falling short. But they also lure us into trying to achieve more of them. And so they're having both of those dual features. Or if a more mathematical example would be more your cup of tea, you might say that ideals are like asymptotes. If you remember your geometry, an asymptote is a line that approaches a limit, but can never actually reach it, that you can only get infinitely closer and closer and closer and closer, but never actually get there. And for me, I think of our actions are like the line, and that the ideal is like the limit, and that our actions can approach the ideal but never reach it. And that's not a criticism. Let's just imagine, for example, the ideal of equality, something that our own nation was founded on, that all persons are created equal. And by embedding this robust ideal in our founding of ourselves as a nation, now we can measure progress and regress. That because we say we want equality, we know that certain things are considered progress and certain things are considered regress. But we can only realistically and practically say X is progress or X is regress because we are saying so relative to that ideal. It's that ideal that tells us realistically right now what counts as progress, realistically right now what counts as success. And we can only actually answer that question relative to some ideal in view. And so, to put this in a WELC context, we could say the ecology of kinship, as WELC is beginning to define it, is our ideal. And now the question is, realistically today, what actions, what laws, what policies, what litigation would move us up that curve to achieve more of that ideal? It's not more, it's not yes or no, it's more or less. Hoping that makes sense. Pausing just for a second. And if you have thoughts, questions, or concerns about this first part that is starting to wrap up on the first thought here, go to the Q&A on your Zoom bar there. Feel free to type in a question or a comment if you have one. So to summarize the first part, it's not idealism or realism. It's which ideals are we realistically going to pursue? I think that that trope that we need to pick idealism or realism is a very effective way of short-circuiting people who have ambitious alternative visions for the future. And one of the things I think is really effective about the be realistic response is that the person putting it forward doesn't have to show the idealist is wrong, doesn't have to show their position is false. In fact, they could even agree with them that their ideal is good, but still say it doesn't matter because it's not realistic. And that's where I think it's useful to push back against those who suggest that in this way. In the second part, I'd like to suggest a second common argument that comes up, I think, in these contexts, and that has to do with the idea of hypocrisy. I actually think that calling people out on hypocrisy is one of the favorite sports of Americans all over, on both sides of the political aisle. And there's an interesting sense in which, if you agree with my view about ideals, it creates an interesting problem for challenges of hypocrisy. Because commonly, we define hypocrisy as the existence of a gap between our stated beliefs and our actions. And if that's what we mean by hypocrisy, then we're kind of in trouble, because if we're always pursuing different ideals and will never achieve those ideals fully, then there's inevitably and unavoidably going to be a gap between what you believe, the ideal, and what you do in your actions. And does that then mean that hypocrisy becomes unavoidable? Does that make sense? So if you're pursuing an ideal, the ideal is not fully achievable, then there'll always be a gap between what you believe and what you do. And then does hypocrisy become unavoidable? Are we all carbon exhaling hypocrites, right? We care about climate change, but here we are contradicting ourselves. In this context, I think of this famous quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who talks about a foolish consistency being the hobgoblin of little minds. And I think we're frequently wrapped into what I would consider a foolish consistency, and defining hypocrisy in terms of a foolish consistency. Let me explain what I mean. I want to suggest that actually we can't adequately or accurately describe or define hypocrisy in terms of the mere gap, that the mere existence of the gap between your belief and your action is not going to actually tell us sufficiently whether or not you're a hypocrite. I think instead what we need to do is be a little more precise in defining hypocrisy. That I would say that hypocrisy is more than just the gap. It's actually when you're merely giving lip service to what you say you believe, that importantly, when given the opportunity and the means to achieve more of what you say you believe, you don't. You say you believe this, you have the opportunity, you have the means, and you don't take measurable action to achieve that, then to me, that's morally culpable. That's problematic. However, if you are someone who is pursuing the good and doing your best, but yet you fall short of achieving your goal, I would suggest that that's just simply being morally finite. If you're pursuing an ideal that is noble and good, and you inevitably, as you will, fall short because you can never fully achieve your ideal, there'll always be a gap. But the question is whether that gap motivates you to try to do better or not. If it does, if when given the opportunity and when you have the means, you take it to achieve more of what you say you care about, well, to me, that isn't morally culpable or blameworthy. That's a function of being a finite human being. Moral finitude is unavoidable, and being morally finite, to me, is quite different than being a hypocrite. And I think we get stuck on that first bullet and think that it's enough to tell us whether or not someone is a hypocrite or not. And I would suggest to you that it's not. I ran across this quote from the wonderful Harvard historian of science, Naomi Oreskes, a few years ago. And she said, people will frequently respond to her by saying, but don't we all use fossil fuels? Aren't we all hypocrites? And she points out, of course we do. And people in the North wore clothes made of cotton picked by slaves, but that did not make them hypocrites when they joined the abolition movement. It just meant that they were also part of the slave economy and they knew it. And that's why they act to change the system, not just their clothes. If they just took off those clothes and said they'd done their part, that would be a foolish consistency. The point is not to have some sort of purity or a foolish consistency, but rather to achieve more of what you say is really good, is truly ideal. Or to quote a favorite philosopher of mine, Karen J. Warren, puts it in a similar way, that within very problematic systems such as we have today, one simply can't make ecologically perfect decisions or lead an ecologically perfect lifestyle within the structures that we currently have, that we have no choice but to expend fossil fuels in our efforts to try to get to a world in which there is no burning of fossil fuels. And that's not hypocrisy, that's being morally finite, that's functioning in and trying to change the system of which we're a part. So again, to me, hypocrisy does not just depend on the gap, but on whether one's actions are truly and meaningfully in service of your ideals. Let's consider an example that is poignant to me right now, and that is the wonderful Dr. Jane Goodall, who, as you no doubt know, just recently passed away. And a few years ago, she came to Gonzaga University, here where I teach, and gave a talk. And I remember some people saying, well, she's a hypocrite because she was flying all around the world. And it's been on my mind since she passed away. And so let's use her as an example of whether or not she was a hypocrite, according to my analysis. So first we need to ask not whether there's a gap between her ideals and beliefs, but just first of all, what are her ideals? And at least as they're stated by the Jane Goodall Institute, the vision is a healthy planet where people make compassionate choices to live sustainably and in harmony with each other, the environment, and other animals. I think this ideal is quite similar to the Emergent Horizons Ecology of Kinship idea that WELC is depicting as well. So this is a really robust, beautiful ideal. So then we can say, well, did she fall short of her ideals? Yep, of course she did. Of course she did, because that ideal is never fully achievable. You're always going to be asymptotically pursuing it. But again, just the existence of a gap between her stated beliefs and her actions isn't enough to tell us whether or not she was a hypocrite. Instead, what we've got to figure out is she could have taken a couple of different choices in her life. She could have stayed in the jungles of Gombe studying chimps and just spent her life there. Or she could use the notoriety and platform that she had earned and developed to go around the world and try and persuade people to act on behalf of people and the planet. That's so when she told us at Gonzaga that she hadn't spent more than a couple of weeks in any one place for years, that she was constantly traveling. And it was clear that she also didn't particularly like it. It wasn't that she enjoyed the traveling. In fact, I think she didn't particularly. I think if you read her work or have watched her, you know that she'd probably have preferred to stay in the jungle with the chimps and just hung out with her friends and studied them and with them. Which one would have had a smaller footprint, a carbon footprint, an ecological footprint? Well, that's pretty easy too. Staying in the jungle would have had a much smaller carbon footprint. She would have expended far fewer resources if she had stayed in the jungle. But I don't think that actually tells us whether or not she was being a hypocrite. I would suggest that what we need to ask is which of these two choices would actually have meaningfully achieved more of the ideals she says she cared about. If her ideal is this, she realized, I guess, that she couldn't stay in the jungle. If she cares about this, she had a responsibility to go and to try and persuade people to act. And so actually, even though it had a higher carbon footprint, the less hypocritical action, the morally finite choice that she made was to expend significant resources in service of trying to achieve more of her ideal, to move her up that curve, that line, to achieve more of her ideals. And so in that way, I think she was not a hypocrite at all, because she did, in fact, do what she could to achieve more of her ideals. And so that's my main point, is just that there's a false dilemma between idealism and realism, and that charges of hypocrisy are actually just attempts to maintain the power and structures of the status quo, so that the actual choice in front of us is not simply idealism or realism, or hypocrisy or not. It's how do we act on behalf of really worthwhile ideals, incrementally moving toward them, always falling short, always being morally finite. But if given the reason, the opportunity, and the means, we do everything we can to achieve more of them. And that is what we should be doing. In the last little bit of time we have together, I'd like to suggest that the environmental movement has an important opportunity that it hasn't always lived up to. That too often, what the environmental movement has done is largely focused on what it's against, and has maybe spent an insufficient amount of time clarifying what it is for. That the problem has too often been defined as a technical problem to be managed, managing our pollution. And we've done insufficient amount to define what the positive vision that we're looking for. And this is something, although I don't agree with much of what the Breakthrough Institute says, this in 2004, in this work, The Death of Environmentalism, the authors made a similar claim that the environmental movement has been too reductive and too negative in its depiction, that it's clear that it's against air pollution, against water pollution, against species extinction. Those are all good things to be against, but it hasn't been sufficiently clear about what it's for. What is the vision positively that we're trying to bring about? And they contrast this with the civil rights movement, where they note that Dr. King and the rest of those who were advocating for civil rights were against Jim Crow and against segregation, against racism, but they also, didn't stop there. That it was not left in a negative framing of what they were against. That what animated and motivated, I would say, generations of people was the positive vision of the beloved community that we all want to bring about, and people have been, fight and die for generations to try and realize more of this ideal. And as an ideal, it's not fully achievable. Again, we'll never have perfect equality, but we can definitely be closer to or farther from that ideal. And it's that positive vision that arguably has been sometimes lacking in the environmental movement. And I see this sometimes in the work of, I think Bill McKibben maybe is turning a leaf on this, but at times some of his work has been negative. In this piece in The Atlantic a few years ago, he argued that we need a world war against climate change. And he is right in many ways. What he means, of course, is that we need the level of mobilization of society needs to be akin to the level of mobilization we had in World War I, World War II, that all of society needs to be focused on addressing the climate crisis. And he's not wrong, but my point is that this is a very negative framing. Having a war together forever is a pretty negative framing. How do we, that as an ideal is pretty negative. And in this way, I think we can do better. A more positive vision that I have thought about sometimes, Gonzaga has a beautiful campus in Florence, Italy, and this is the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence. And many of these beautiful cathedrals were a multi-generational project. And my metaphor here is this idea of that what we need to do as a movement is build something beautiful together across generations, not just fight against something bad, but to build something beautiful together, like this cathedral. Or to use a more natural metaphor, we might again be reminded of the beautiful words of Jane Goodall, and see our cathedrals as the forests and mountains and streams that we're all wanting to protect. And this, I think, is what WELC is seeking to do through its ecology of kinship and this amazingly robust view. So to conclude, the choice is not between idealism or realism. The choice is really between competing ideals, the ideals of the status quo or of something else. And then what is that something else? And so what we should really be asking ourselves is, what are the ideals that we're pursuing? Are they in fact good? And if so, exactly what do they require of us right here and now? How do I achieve more of them? And that's the only realistic option in front of us, is a life realistically pursuing worthwhile ideals. And so I would suggest then the point is not whether you have ideals, but whether or not you're willing to defend and scrutinize them and the courage to pursue them. If any of this was interesting, this part of this talk is covered in a book that I wrote a few years ago called Riders in the Storm. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more about it, you can take a look at that last few chapters of this book if you're interested. And that looks like we got about 15 minutes. That's perfect, Michelle, I think.
Yes, well played. Excellent, excellent timing and excellent job. Thank you so much for all of that, Brian. It's incredibly interesting and just important discussions to have right now. So, as Brian said, we do have time for questions. So feel free to type those in the Q&A box, or if you would rather ask them verbally, feel free to raise your hand, and we can unmute you and you can ask your question there.
To raise your hand, just click on React at the bottom and then click on Raise Hand, and that'll get you there.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, an important tip on that of how to do that. And then also real quick, I wanted to announce our winner of our stainless steel WELC Cup was Janet Hedgepath. So Janet, I'm not sure if you're still on the call, but I'll reach out to you separately on getting that cup to you. So we can go ahead and move to questions now if anyone has anything.
Thank you for the nice comment there, Kathy. Looks like Brian, are you taking yourself off mute? Do you have a question? Maybe not. Maybe that was an accident. John, did you have a question?
Yes. So how do we convince those people who are very powerful, who are completely invested in the status quo, to change?
So I have an idea, but I don't know that you're going to like it. I don't think you can force anything. I don't know what that would even look like. I really think that things change if we have a beautiful vision that's so compelling that it draws a lot of people into behind it. I think what we see in earlier social movements is the emergence of ideas that are so beautiful and so compelling that people start spending quite a bit of time, energy to try to bring them about. And that's quite different than being terrified of bad things. And we're right to be terrified about all sorts of very terrifying things happening, but we can't really stay afraid. And this is part of my concern sometimes with Bill McKibben, whom I really admire and appreciate. I really sincerely do. But sometimes his writing ends on a rather negative note. And so if you were living in Ukraine right now, you would be living in a constant state of fear of being hit by ammunition, and yet people report that you can't stay physiologically. You can't stay afraid forever. Your body literally can't do it, which is good, because fear is meant to be an immediate response to an immediate danger. And so trying to get people to be rightly afraid, I think, has been a bit of a dead end for the environmental movement. So I would say, to answer your question, that trying to persuade people that they need to be scared, even if that's you think it's right, and there are reasons to be scared, I don't think is going to work long term. Or just that. I think what we need is a really beautiful, compelling vision that inspires people to join a multi-generational project. What worries me and why I think you might not be satisfied and why I'm not satisfied is, do we have time? Like that's a long-term project, and some of our problems have very short fuses, and that's a mismatch between how long these things take. But I don't really see a sufficient alternative. So that's my thought, John. I don't know if you have a response, but
Thank you.
thanks, John. Mark, did you have a comment or a question? Oops, I think you're still on mute. There you go.
Well, okay. In the real world, I'm 86 years old. Over the last 70 years, I've saved enormous amount of habitat with a wild idea. Like, for example, we saved 8,000 pristine acres of wildlife habitat that was going to have a city the size of Annapolis. And one of my volunteers said, gee, if I knew we could have won, I would have helped. It was an impossible mission, but we succeeded. And over again, I found that it's worth trying. And about 1/3 of the time, we do Mission Impossible. I just want to pass that on.
Yep. And I assume that people, when they learn about it and when they experience it, they're very inspired by what you achieved and want to do more, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the best ones, mile a minute vine used to climb 6 inches a day, and now it's no longer a problem. And I supported the research into a biological control that doesn't, it's a bug that eats that and doesn't, that non-native invasive species, it doesn't eat anything else. And as a park ranger, I released it, and it was so nice to see it work. I mean, so again, research into biological controls that are host specific and effective is another one that often works. It's worth a try.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I admire that. My only comment would be that that can be presented in a very technocratic way, or it can be presented as part of a vision for a symbiotic human-Earth relationship. And I want to push us toward the latter, where we see that not just as managing, effectively the planet as its engineers, but rather seeing that as a form of being part of a biotic community where we're members of that. And I think that's compatible with what you're saying, but the narrative context I'm going to suggest matters. Like, are we seeing that as part of a control and command approach, or is that part of trying to become, thoughtful members of the Earth community? Let's see, we have a question or comment from Suzanne. She says, I'm on a management team of a Forest Service collaborative, and we're trying to figure out whether we want to become political or just deal with conditions as they develop in today's political atmosphere. How do I pull them toward being a voice for the voiceless? Well, I guess the main thrust would be to talk about, outline, and imagine ideals that are inspiring enough to make people want to spend time fighting for them together. I'm not sure, Suzanne, if you wanted to come off mute and chat a little bit more or not, but that would be the general approach. Susan, did you want to jump in, or are you good?
Well, I think say that recommendation again. I kind of,
yeah, I mean,
trying to unmute myself, I sort of lost it.
No worries, that's totally fair. I put you on the spot. So, I mean, my idea would be to think together about what beautiful ideals that you want to be in service of together, and then realistically what would move you toward them. So doing some visioning work of what do we imagine the futures that we're trying to create, and really giving yourself some space to depict that in a pretty interestingly full way, and then say, okay, what would move us closer to that? What do we need to do differently to be able to move ourselves closer to that, but grounded in that positive, beautiful vision that multi-generational project that you want to pursue together. So I'm not sure if that's very satisfying, but that would be a philosopher's suggestion.
Yeah, I think doing that visioning work is something that we would have to do as a management team, because the management team and most of the members of the collaborative are very project oriented and realistic, and
Right.
They don't really like to discuss idealism very much.
Yeah. Well,
So
I'm happy to come and give this talk or a version of it if you'd like, but but I think that I get it. You're a lot of practical, hard-nosed sort of folks, and I just want to say again, it's not an either or. It's really, you're pursuing ideals. You
Right.
want to be realistically pursuing something you think is good, but oftentimes you're never asked to defend what that good is or why you think it's good. And I think it's worth asking the status quo to say, well, what you're saying, realistic action in service of, what are the ideals in service of which that means, that's good, and giving an opportunity to create some space. So it's not either or.
Yeah, I think that the district ranger is probably the most idealistic person
Interesting.
in
Yeah.
the group.
Interesting.
I really like where he goes.
That's so interesting.
So
Well,
we're very lucky to have somebody like that.
very cool. Well,
Yeah.
good luck, Susan.
Thanks.
Rebecca, what are you thinking? Oh, you're still on mute there, Rebecca.
Yes, sorry. I'm sitting here in Geneva, Switzerland, where I've spent 15 years trying to work with international agencies, the NGOs, and to make these ideas that were part of their mandate come into play. And there's a feeling here, very dispirited sometimes, with what's happening and the layoffs and the fact that the multilateralism never got achieved. However, I just finished a feature-length documentary going around the world and making segments on people who, with no resources, have decided to try to create safe passage in one way or another for wildlife, to reduce human wildlife conflict, or I did the California cougar program as well. And the one thing that I would say in terms of the ideals is that so many of these things are already part of, that are on WELC's list and on so many other lists, are already part of much local community or indigenous wisdom about these things. And what was amazing was to see how similar a lot of the approaches were, especially if people were given a seat at the table. And I would say that I would question, and I had sent in a question about this earlier, I don't know if it was received, whether or not, I don't believe that Jane Goodall, and I was supposed to teach at the College of African Wildlife Management in Tanzania as well. I think she would have said, yes, it's important to have this vision, but also there need to be consequences. There need to be people still trying to stop the poaching of the chimps. And I believe that there has to be a balance, which is what WELC is all about too, of creating law, statutory situations that also protect, because there will, in my mind, always be somebody who in self-favor, try to minimize, no matter how compelling the overall vision is. And I just was wondering if you could address that, because I believe that I've seen where there are no consequences, somebody will come in and change what's been people have worked so hard to achieve.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement. It's not an either or. And you were talking about, so like the consequences, or the bad or good things that happen are we can describe as bad or good because they're either achieving more of what we value or less. They're either more of the ideal or less. So the ideal is the measuring stick, and then what happens is good or bad relative to that measuring stick. And so it's not enough to have a measuring stick. You've got to have actions. Yeah, and the consequences are good or bad. But I think we jump past what exactly is the measuring stick, and we just talk about measures without being clear about the vision that we're trying to achieve. So it's not an either or. You can't replace one or the other. I don't want the status quo. Status quo can't get off the hook from saying what are its ideals. It doesn't get to just count itself as realistic. It should have to defend itself as well. And then the idealist should have to do the same. So these are my ideals, and this is what I think would move us closer to achieving them. So I think we're in agreement, but I might also be misunderstanding your question. I think that Goodall's a great example of somebody who was trying to do both. Who was trying to do both very concretely. The Roots and Shoots programs that she helped create all over the world, she would go and encourage young people to create these Roots and Shoots clubs, and they would pick a project that would help people and animals and the planet in their community. And it was like this, the Goodall vision, but like locally, what can we do to move us closer? So I love that version of that. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Gary in the Q&A, and we're just about out of time here, asks, what are some ideals that the status quo clings to, and how do we argue against them? I mentioned a couple, happiness through consumption and safety through violence, infinite economic growth are some of the ideals and myths of the status quo. And I imagine you could help depict quite a few others. They're all not fully achievable. And that's fine. They're ideals. To be really dramatic, let's say, Hitler had an ideal of an Aryan race. The problem wasn't that it was not realistic. The problem was that it was a terrible ideal. White nationalists have ideals. The problem isn't that they're idealistic or they can't be fully achieved. The problem is they're horrible ideals. And so, it's not a realism versus idealism. It's ideals are in competition, and including the status quo's ideals, and they should have to defend themselves. And then we should, in having that conversation, to say, okay, which ones are worthwhile, and what would move us closer to achieving them. And I really admire WELC in trying to imagine not just how do we protect the last few environmental laws that we still have, but how do we also bring about the next generation of environmental laws that would be in service of an ecology of kinship? How do we help create statutes and policies that would move us closer to an ecology of kinship? What are those systems changes that are needed? So it's not just a fighting against the awful things that are taking place, although WELC is doing that and winning. It's also how do we fight to build something beautiful together? And I really admire WELC in trying to do that. Michelle, I'll defer to you about whether to go to more questions since we're at time.
Yeah, I'm happy to if we want to answer. I think there's a couple in the chat, and then Mark. But if folks do have to drop off, no worries at all. The recording will be circulated to everyone. And also on that note, just want to say much gratitude for joining. These are really important conversations, and it's just such an important time to be showing up right now. And WELC wouldn't be WELC without our supporters. So just much gratitude to everyone. But yeah, Brian, if you have a couple more minutes and you want to answer these final questions, I'm happy to stay on. So.
Yeah, I see Kathleen's and Rebecca. I'm sorry, I don't see one in the Q&A from you, so I think something did go wrong. Apologies, but I didn't ignore anything on purpose at all. Kathleen asks about social media, and everybody hopefully can go to the Q&A and read it because it's a little bit a few sentences there. But how should the inevitable negative response and bullying be dealt with? Try to push back or ignore it, just keep on keeping on. And this is something that I struggle a lot with. There's a lot of good evidence that those spaces are sufficiently toxic that I've elected largely to step out of them for my own mental health, because I'm not persuaded that I can achieve much good. But that's a risk. I don't know if that's the right strategy overall. I would not. We should have Brian Sweeney on from WELC, and he can talk about that a little bit more, or Eric, our executive director, who wades into these waters regularly, and so I will just say I'm not sure how I have trouble maintaining my mental health and participating in those conversations. So, but I don't know if that's the right answer. Sorry to punt, Kathleen. Mark, you get the last comment or question if you'd like it.
I wanted to say on the issue of population connection, what's working around the whole world, people do what their neighbors do. So you just show people, look, your neighbors have 2 children per couple. You can do the same, and they do. It's working extremely well all across the.
It's such a good point. I really think that we underestimate the value of role modeling, and it sounds like a cheesy, old-fashioned sort of thing, but more than what you can persuade someone of. As a philosopher, I frequently like to believe that I can make an argument that someone will believe and that they'll change their mind, they'll change their actions. More often, people change, if they do change at all, because they know someone sees something, and so I think the power of role modeling is actually one of the most effective ways that we change the world. It's just very hard to do something with that. You're just living your life, trying to live the best life you can and be who you are. And it's hard to see how and whether that has ripples that have positive effects, but it does. It's just, it's not a billiard ball sort of chain of causal efficacy. So the ripples are there, and they're real, but it is hard to know exactly how to see them and to point them, but they're real. Well, what a fun way to spend a little bit of time together. I would say afternoon, but Rebecca is in Geneva, and so we are in all sorts of different time zones. And so, as Michelle said, thanks for joining us. Thank you for your support of WELC. It's doing amazing work on behalf of the West, and I'm really honored to be affiliated with it.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you again to everyone. Brian, we're super lucky to have you on the WELC team and board, and leading the way with these really important conversations and getting everybody thinking about the critical things. So just much gratitude to you as well, Brian. And with that, yeah, keep your eyes peeled for the recording. I'll also include, as Brian mentioned, the talk he did previously, just for more background on that. And as always, feel welcome to reach out to anyone at WELC or info box if you have specific questions on any of this, or to reach out to Brian as well. We're happy to have those conversations. So thank you again, everyone. And I hope everyone has an excellent rest of